This video clip is to explain the concept of diffusion. Now, when we're having a highly stressful situation and we're feeling quite anxious and quite panicky, it's very easy to amplify the stress that we're feeling by the way we relate to our thoughts. In ACT, we don't actually see the thoughts themselves as being a problem. It's how we internally are looking at our thoughts and relating to our thoughts that can cause a stressful situation to become even more stressful and more distressing because of the way we are relating to our thoughts internally. So cognitive defusion is learning psychological skills that will help us in a very stressful situation to not always take our thoughts too literally, to see them as thoughts and to see the pictures and movies we're creating in our mind's eye as just pictures and movies. They're not literally the real event. So what happens in a state of fusion is we confuse the internal images and thoughts we're having as if they were the real event. And this seems to happen even more strongly when we are in a stressful context. So maybe at an interview at work, or if we've got fears of being in, say, a confined space like a lift or in a train. These particular contextual situations can move us into a state where the thoughts and images we're creating in our head tend to feel as if they are far more real and as if they're actually going to happen, when in fact they are just thoughts and images. So fusion is when we look at our thoughts and images in our head as if they were literally true, and defusion is when we can distinguish internally that we are just having thoughts and images. It may be images of some catastrophizing thing that we think could be happening in the future, but in this present moment in time, there may not be any danger at all. It's just a thought we are having about a possible danger in the future. And if we can psychologically relate to these predictions and thoughts about the future as just predictions and thoughts, and not as absolute realities, then it makes it a little bit easier for us to handle the anxiety and panicky feelings when we're in a stressful situations. Now, to understand this concept a little bit better, because diffusion is one of the key concepts in ACT, and if you can spend a bit of time trying to understand this concept and see how it relates to your stress situation, it can be a very liberating experience, and it can make it much easier for you to stay with your uncomfortable thoughts instead of trying to fight with them and struggle with them, which in a panic situation, any kind of internal struggle tends to add more fuel to the fire. So we want to try to get to a point where we're not fighting our feelings and not fighting our thoughts, because this just activates the adrenal response internally even more, and we get pumped up with even more adrenaline. So if we can relate to our thoughts in a different way and not struggle with them, then it makes it just a little bit easier to cope with the stressful situation we are in. And ACT diffusion skills, which I'll be explaining a lot more about in the next section in this video, can really help us to do that. But first of all, let's just try to get a little bit better understanding of what we mean by diffusion. So probably one of the best ways to explain this is just think for a moment about a time when you were watching a good action movie, or maybe even a horror movie on TV, or maybe in a cinema. Just think of something that comes to mind. Maybe it's sort of just a movie that made you just get really worked up a bit. Now, think of a scene in that movie that sort of was maybe like a really action-packed, and you were re-experiencing that particular scene in the movie. Now, as you do that, as you picture the scene where you were sitting and what you were watching, and that the characters maybe sort of about to get into some kind of danger or some kind of harm, think back to how you were actually feeling at that time. It's quite possible that when the movie had reached its most dramatic moment, at that particular moment in time, you sort of lost consciousness that you were sitting in a movie theatre, that you were with your friends maybe, or with your relatives or partner, and you were just completely in the movie, and whatever was about to happen seemed very, very real. Your heart may have been beating faster, you may be sweating a little bit, you may be holding tight onto your partner's hand or something, because at that moment in time you were completely caught up, what we call fused with what was going on with the characters on stage. It's almost as if it was no longer a movie anymore. It was as if you were in the movie and you were a part of the action that was going on. Now compare this particular, now just try and imagine that you were watching the same movie, the same action-packed thriller, or a little bit maybe of a scary movie. You were watching the same movie but in a slightly different context. So maybe this time the movie was on a television screen in a big room that you were in, and there was, in this particular room, there's like windows and you could see the blue sky outside and the sun was coming in, and you may be seeing some children playing in the park across the road or something, and maybe there's some music coming in from your children playing next door or the next door neighbours. Now if you're watching the same movie in this kind of new context, where you were maybe not totally caught up in the movie, you were like looking at the blue sky outside, you were aware that you were in your room, but you also noticed the movie being played in a small part of the room. Now in this new context, in this new contextual kind of setting, the impact that same movie, it's the same characters, same actions going on, but the impact it has on you psychologically, I think you would agree, would be quite different. Your heart may not be beating so fast, you may not be sweating so fast, you are likely to be holding tight onto the armchair or your partner's hand, because you're not so caught up in the movie. It doesn't feel so real because you see other things going on around you. Whereas in the previous setting, you may have been in a movie theatre where it was dark and all the focus was on the movie, and in that sort of context it can easily sort of get us sucked in and feel as if that the action is really taking place right in this present moment in time. So those two like examples, being completely caught up in the movie, is what we call fusion, and when we can separate from the movie and just see it as pictures on the screen, as events that are just the mind is creating, is what we call defusion. And in ACT we try to we use diffusion skills as a way of trying to just break the illusion that what we're experiencing in a stressful situation is occurring right now. Because what tends to happen is, like when I had my panic attacks and struggled with them for quite a long time, I had sort of various kind of really worrying thoughts about the future. This could happen, that could happen. And whilst I was having those thoughts, I was getting pictures in my mind of some probable disaster that's going to happen in the next week or the next year or whatever, to my family or to myself or whatever. And as I was having those thoughts and those pictures in my mind, I sort of lost consciousness of the room. I was like completely absorbed in this picture, and it was as if, to me at that moment in time, that it wasn't just a thought about the future, it was as if it was happening right now. So we sort of get this kind of time distortion that takes place in our mind when we are in a very fused state. And this can happen to us. We tend to, you're surprising to note how many times this actually happens, even in a normal day. I mean, people talk about daydreaming, and daydreaming is a kind of fusion. It's like a kind of where we're lost in our thought world, the imagination world, but maybe in a more pleasant way. And maybe that's the kind of fusion which we don't really need to pop the illusion, because it's not actually causing us any problems. But certain times, when in certain stressful situations, it's useful just to have little kind of psychological skills or psychological techniques that help to just pop the illusion a little bit that what we're experiencing, the thoughts and the images we're creating at that moment in time, are just thoughts and images. They're not really at that specific moment in time actually happening, although they can feel as though they're happening if we're very, very entangled and caught up in the thoughts and images that we're having. Okay, so I hope that gives you an understanding of what cognitive diffusion is and why it's so useful to have these cognitive diffusion skills as part of your toolkit in a way when you're in psychological distress. And we will be, in the next section, we'll be looking at a whole series of cognitive diffusion skills that you can play around with and find out which ones will help you personally to basically start to see the images and thoughts you're having when you're in a distressful situation as thoughts and images. And I look forward to sharing them with you. Thank you for listening.